This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for Tuesday, February 12th, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, flatoids?
Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, checkers.
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to look at Canada's forests and carbon emissions, and then Adam is going to explore Islamophobia and a flat earth promoted by a Gatineau councillor. But first, are there any silver linings in the measles outbreak, Cristina?
Last month, Washington State declared a public health emergency over an ongoing outbreak of measles. But wait, you ask, didn't the U.S. eliminate measles in 2000? Why, yes, checkers. Yes, it did. As Popular Science put it, maybe somebody should tell the measles.
Huh.
There are many great news articles covering what's going on, and you'll find a ton of links in our show notes at trcpodcast.com.
That's a great website.
I just want to do a quick overview of what's up so that I can get to the good stuff, the silver lining, so to speak. First, what's measles? According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, measles is a highly contagious virus that lives in the nose and throat mucus of an infected person. It can spread to others through coughing and sneezing. The measles virus can live up for 2 hours in an airspace where the infected person coughed or sneezed. If other people breathe the contaminated air or touch the infected surface, then touch their eyes, noses, or mouths, they can become infected. Measles is so contagious that if one person has it, 90% of the people close to that person who are not immune will also become infected.
Damn!
Wow. Measles virus is also not spread by any other animal species. Now, it's noteworthy that before the measles vaccine, around 3 to 4 million people got the disease every year. Pretty much everyone got it by the age of 15. The measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or MMR for short, was licensed for use in 1971, but standalone vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella were licensed throughout the 60s. So if you were born after 1968, you really didn't have to worry about interacting with measles ever. We know for a fact that out of all the people who get the recommended 2 doses of vaccine, almost none will contract the disease, even after being exposed to it. So what do we know about this recent outbreak so far? There have been over 50 cases of measles reported in Clark County, Washington, since January, and 47 of those cases, mostly kids from the ages of 1 to 10 years old, were unvaccinated. A few other cases have popped up in Oregon, a neighboring state, and there is a potential case being investigated in Vancouver, Canada.
Oh, damn. Not cool.
According to a 2018 study from the Canadian Pediatric Society, Canada eradicated the disease in 1998. So any cases of the measles post-98 in Canada originated from international travelers spreading the virus in areas of low immunity. Now, in 2017, there was actually a measles outbreak in Nova Scotia. I don't really remember this too much. Handful of cases recorded in the Greater Toronto Area, Calgary, Kingston, and Fredericton at the same time. Now, the scary thing about this recent U.S. outbreak is that Oregon and Washington are very lax about letting parents opt out of vaccines. So there are likely to be more children at risk in those states compared to others. Now, every U.S. state has legislation requiring student vaccines, but most allow exemptions for religious beliefs. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times reported a recent outbreak of measles in New York State with over 180 confirmed cases occurring in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. Now, in Ontario, New Brunswick, Australia, many U.S. states, non-medical exemptions are allowed and requests are unfortunately on the rise both here and in the U.S. Around 18 states grant so-called philosophical exemptions, can you see my air quotes, to parents because of moral or personal beliefs. Exceptions are Mississippi, California, and West Virginia, which have very strict laws and do not allow religious or philosophical exemptions. Wow. Now, according to the Washington Post, around 8% of children in Clark County had exemptions from vaccines ahead of starting kindergarten in 2017. And in Oregon, the rate of exemptions shot to 7.5% in 2018. So just to give you guys a frame of reference, the national average is 2%. In a recent Vox article, Peter Hotz, a Baylor College of Medicine infectious diseases researcher, says, They, as in Oregon, Washington, are now a major anti-vaccine hotspot due to non-medical vaccine exemptions that have nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
Now, Holtz doesn't mince words. He goes on to say that even though measles was eliminated in 2000, it's made a return in part because of, quote, ignorant and cowardly state legislatures and a failure by governments to mount a pro-vaccine advocacy campaign. Now, this may seem like a Debbie Downer segment, but in disguise, it's really about the importance of fostering critical thinking and a little validation that all the time we invest in doing this podcast is worth it. A couple of days ago, the Washington Post published an article titled, Unvaccinated Teens Are Fact-Checking Their Parents and Trying to Get Shots on Their Own.
Wow.
Emboldened teenagers raised by anti-vax moms and dads are increasingly having discussions online, mostly Reddit, about making their own informed, evidence-based decisions to pursue vaccinations in defiance of their parents. Ethan Lindenberger, who's profiled in this Washington Post story, 18-year-old whose video is linked in the WP article. I highly recommend watching it. He wrote a post on Reddit asking for advice on how to get vaccinated since he was old enough to do it without his parents' permission. He'd become increasingly frustrated with his mom, who perpetuated a lot of misinformation, including pulling out the beyond debunked vaccines cause autism card, and even shared anti-vax videos on social media. He became increasingly concerned about his 4 younger siblings, who are all unvaccinated, and more frustrated after his efforts in presenting evidence in the form of scientific papers and CDC studies fell on deaf ears. We feel you, Ethan.
Yeah.
His post garnered over 1,000 comments, including helpful advice on how to navigate the healthcare system, and in December, he visited an Ohio Department of Health office to get vaccinated. Another underage teen posted this insightful comment. I, as well as my siblings, hold the ideology that vaccines are a public health issue and a personal responsibility to the benefit of the population, not a right you can revoke from your children.
Wow.
Now, in Australia, teens 15 and older are getting immunizations behind their anti-vax parents' backs using a state law to get medical care without their parents' consent or knowledge. Now, Lindenberg suggested that instead of trying to implement stricter immunization laws or blocking exemptions, which, as you guys can imagine, can be an uphill legal battle, perhaps states should lower the age of consent required for vaccinations. Interesting thought.
Yeah.
Now, another glimmer of hope, according to a global news report published just yesterday, Washington state health officials saw measles vaccinations spike nearly 500% after the outbreak compared to the average of the previous 4 years in the same time period. So to frame that for you guys, only 117 vaccines containing measles were given to kids under 18 the first week of January 2019. By the last week of January, more than 1,000 vaccines had been administered. As Steven Pinker will remind us, the most powerful contributor to the fight against vaccine-preventable diseases is science. So, quick footnote. I guess I'm not ending on a good note if I mention this, but Pat sent this to me late in the day. It's an alarming news story, and I hadn't heard about it until he sent this to me. There is a measles outbreak in the Philippines that killed 70 people, and vaccine fear-mongering is being blamed.
Ugh.
Reports from the Department of Health and the World Health Organization showed that as of December 2018, there were more than 20,000 reported measles cases in the Philippines, a 500% increase from the year before.
I think 70 people died in the month of January, actually.
That's brutal.
Yes, you're correct, yeah.
It's infuriating. It's infuriating because measles kind of went away. Mm-hmm. And there's a good reason that it went away. And so the idea that 70 people in the Philippines died or that, there's an outbreak anywhere, it's saddening. It's so saddening.
Well, it can be also alarming because, you guys know what herd immunity is. Yeah. And vaccine coverage needs to be around 95% to prevent the virus from circulating in communities. Mm-hmm. And CDC's 2017 data was around 91% of kids across the U.S. got the MMR vaccine, which is almost enough to achieve herd immunity.
What's next? Polio or
vaccines? As we know, the surest sign they're effective is that you just don't think about them much. You don't worry about it, and our brains apparently don't work that well, or people haven't lived through the horror of it, and therefore don't see the utility of the vaccine. And then lots of people are going to suffer from it.
Now, Cristina, as to your point about the lowest legal age for children to get medical services on their own. I imagine these laws don't exist for children getting vaccinated when their anti-vax parents don't want them. I imagine these laws exist for reasons like people getting access to birth control when their parents don't want it or something like that. So maybe all that needs is for legislators to understand the broadening scope of the usage of these things. But at the end of the day, there's a firm lower limit to that. No one's going to be like 8 years old wandering on their own without their parents into a clinic asking to get vaccinated. At one point, it's going to be maybe 12, 13 is going to be your limit on something like that, right?
Thanks, Cristina. Always depressing if people can't see the forest for the trees, which leads us to Canada's forests and carbon emissions. I love hikes in the wilderness. Being surrounded by trees feels like a breath of fresh air compared to city life. A good reason for that feeling might be the oxygen that trees provide through photosynthesis. A quick refresh. Roots take in water from the ground, leaves absorb light and carbon dioxide. The carbon is taken and combined with water to make sugar, and oxygen is produced as a byproduct.
Maple syrup and oxygen. That's awesome.
That's how plants make proteins and fats and grow. But does that mean the trees hold onto this carbon dioxide forever? It's not like they're holding onto CO2 as a gas inside a tree. That makes no sense. Which leads to the question, are forests a place where carbon is absorbed or emitted? I covered this topic way back in 2009 on episode 38 in response to a listener question. But when I went to our website, which is great, all the links were broken, which is not so great.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
CBC just published an article on the topic by Robson Fletcher, so I thought it was a good time to revisit it. Canada has a lot of trees. All that carbon dioxide was used to grow all those trees. In general, the bigger the tree, the more carbon it has absorbed. Given Canada's many trees, it is tempting to think that our large forests are carbon sinks. But what happens when the tree dies? Matter is neither created nor destroyed, it just changes form, as you can find from a chemist or your local religious friend. And the half-life of various atoms is stupidly long compared to the lifespan of a tree, so it's not like the atom of carbon is going to go away.
I do have a long half-life.
Yes, up and at them. So a tree that is full of carbon will then be releasing that carbon in some way. Now, Fletcher links to a Facebook post by Lowell Green, who's known to be a bit on the right and a bit of a climate denialist.
Yeah.
Green was driving along the highway, I believe in Ontario, and he saw lots of trees. And he kept driving and saw more trees. Look at that. All these wonderful trees sucking up carbon dioxide. Nothing to worry about on climate change.
What a take.
Yep. Now, to be fair, when I was much younger, and I think we were visiting out west, lots of rolling trees and hills along the highway. And it wasn't that I had concerns about climate because I was young. I didn't think about it. But I was like, there's so many trees.
Yeah.
Why do we need to worry about trees? Look how many there are.
Who cares? They cut one up down in the lawn.
And then I turned 8. Now, I actually ended up commenting on that Facebook post. So I followed it from the CBC article. And I wrote the carbon's got to go back, guys. What's this about? Even though the last comment was 32 weeks ago. I became involved in the story. I just want you to make aware of my conflict now. Fletcher provides us with a harsh truth, quoting the article. When you add up both the absorption and emission, Canada's forests haven't been a net carbon sink since 2001. Due largely to forest fires and insect infestations, the trees have actually added to our country's greenhouse gas emissions for each of the past 15 years on record. Ouch. Now, given what we know, greenhouse gases are bad. That's not good. Not good for the planet, not good for Canada meeting its emissions targets. Which raises the issue of what should count towards a country's emissions. Yeah. We know there's a lot of science here, but there's also a lot of political maneuvering. Now, for some context, our baseline is about 700 megatons of CO2 annually, or equivalent. That's what Canada releases as a country.
Okay.
Many countries want to reduce their emissions, but sadly, we must acknowledge that perhaps just as strongly, they want to be perceived as reducing their emissions. If you can't get your actual emissions to go down, what if you change your methodology and make it seem like you did?
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yay, tainted science. To be fair, methodologies can be updated for good reasons, but all too often the political pressure is driving how things are accounted instead of something more evidence-based and consistent. Those that engage in the business of counting emissions are aware of the whole tree issue, even if the general public isn't. So Canada did actually have the option of excluding our forests under international agreements, and therefore we have tended to exclude them when adding up our greenhouse gas emissions totals.
Well, it's just something we have somewhat limited control over.
Right, so that's a fair case, right? Sense. Exactly, but you can't control it. But of course, we benefit from all our natural resources.
Yes.
And
there are ways to manage forest fires. So even even accidents are often avoidable. Right?
Mm-hmm. So Canada has both managed and unmanaged forests, with the managed accounting for about 65% of our forests and over 220 million hectares. Just because I'm always curious about this, like, what's a hectare again? So, metric system unit of area equal to a square with 100-meter sides, or 10,000 meters squared. All right? 100 hectares in 1 square kilometer. An acre is about 0.4 hectares, and 1 hectare contains about 2.47 acres. Now, for some context, in 2016, Canada's managed forests contributed a net of 78 megatons of emissions. Bad, basically. That said, according to the CBC article, Canada is now arguing that it should only be responsible for man-made changes to our forests. So not just managed, but man-made changes. So fires or the pine beetle problem wouldn't count against us. Yeah. Under this metric, our trees would become a sink. In fact, if you only look at areas of human-caused forestry activity in Canada, then those would have an average annual sink of 26 megatons since 2001.
Well, it seems like it's fine that you don't count the forest fires, but then you can't count the trees as a sink at all. Right? Pick one or the other.
That's one of the arguments.
You gotta make your mind up. Right?
So Fletcher points out that 26 megatons is but a fraction of our 700 megatons annual output.
Yeah, it's a decent fraction.
Not that decent. We're talking like 4% or less.
Yeah.
Now, every little bit counts, Adam, yes, we're using your line. So using this method and perhaps changing the counting methodology for other biomass issues will bring us closer to our reduction targets. But that's not because we've actually reduced our emissions.
We just played with the numbers.
Exactly. Like, look at all the progress we've done by changing the method by which we count things. Now, in conclusion, trees are not a permanent carbon sink. You have to keep planting new ones before the old ones die. That's the main message of the segment.
Yeah.
Second, different methodologies yield different emissions numbers, and, unsurprisingly, Canada is arguing for the one that shows them in the best light. What does the panel think?
Well, it sounds like unless you're having new trees that will, like new trees and new forests that will be there longer, it doesn't really make a difference. There's sort of an equilibrium point that you reach with forests growing and burning, right? So if you can kind of eliminate the whole difference somehow, then maybe that makes more sense. But does the existence of a forest contribute more to carbon emissions than it reduces, or does it sort of even itself out, right?
Probably eventually evens itself out on average, but it would depend on the forest. It would depend on the area, right?
And I find it interesting that forest fires account because, obviously wood burning is a major polluter. That's why it's outlawed in many cities, and in rural areas it's less of an issue just because people are more sparsely populated. But obviously wood burning creates carbon emissions, but it's funny to think that it's like re-releasing that carbon back into the air that it seeped out at some point. So
now, to be fair, wood that is harvested and sold and put into products does also release the carbon eventually. Yeah. Like, in a way, like...
Oh, like if I make a deck out of wood, that carbon gets released in the atmosphere.
Well, like eventually the deck decomposes. Like, things are just a matter of time. Now, I think you can imagine like making a deck which lasts for decades. As opposed to... Yeah, there you go, Adam. Thank you. that's what I was going for. Is better than a tree that only lasts a few years. And I think maybe a scientician can write in that a forest fire is worse than just the tree, say, falling over and decomposing into the soil in terms of carbon release, just because of the rapidity of the whole process. But it just seems like a temporary move because, as I said, the carbon atoms aren't decaying on their own into other constituent parts, so it's just a matter of moving it around in different ways and trying to keep it out of the places we don't want it to be.
The spin.
But the fact that we're actually talking about it as opposed to it not being talked about in other places is, I guess...
sure, yes. Yeah. Silver linings all over the place. Good point, Pat. Yes. Well, if you're getting kind of bummed out by the measles and carbon emission stories, now we turn to something lighter. Islamophobia and flat earth being promoted by a local politician. Is that correct, Adam?
Somewhat. A local city councillor from Gatineau made headlines around the globe last week after making a comment about believing the world was flat. Since this is a local issue to me, I thought I'd talk about it for the show. For context, I've lived in Gatineau most of the last 5 years. I recently moved to the city of Gatineau to Chelsea, a neighboring city, which is basically the area adjacent to Gatineau Park. But I lived in Gatineau for most of those 5 years.
And a short shout out to Adam that he traveled through this snowstorm to be here to record it while the rest of us just stayed in our homes.
And also, side note, I grew up in Gatineau as well.
Now, was that what was originally Gatineau, or was it like in Hull or
Yes.
Elmer or something? It was okay.
Yeah.
So where I lived was what used to be Hull near Elmer, but it's an amalgamated city that is just Gatineau, kind of like the GTA and other things like that. So it's a city in Quebec that is on the other side of the Ottawa River. So it's next to the city of Ottawa. People don't really think of it as one city, but they're so connected, and a lot of people that live in one city work in the other, like me, like Darren, like a lot of people. Now, as a French Canadian from Ottawa, I've spent some time in the city prior to living there, and have known people from there and elsewhere in Quebec most of my life. So much to say, I don't speak for the people of Gatineau or Quebec in general, but throughout the segment, I'll be making some observations which certainly cannot be said to represent the views of all of the people in these areas. So if you do actually live there, you may pay more attention to politics than I do, and you may take issue with some of the things I say, but I just want to give a bit of context that people may not always get here. So what's happened? So the original piece on this I saw was sent to me from Darren and reported on a Gatineau councillor, Nathalie Lemieux, who questioned the evidence that the Earth was round. What? So, since there's always the possibility of something being lost in translation, I wanted to track down the original comment with context and translate it as well as I could. Unfortunately, the original link isn't something I was able to turn up, as the original comment, it was likely deleted. And now this was a comment on an article about YouTube shutting down conspiracy theory videos. It was confirmed that Nathalie Lemieux made this comment, but nothing else was stated. So she didn't have any follow-up, she didn't excuse it, she didn't double down, nothing. So here's the quote. In English, the original quote was in French. The important thing is not what I believe, but the truth will set people free. The first question to ask is why, now that people realize that it's possible that the Earth is flat, that they want to hide the explanations that prove it. How much money is given to NASA? Who decided the Earth was round, and why believe them? So many questions. And there's an emoji of the little rubbing the chin emoji. Personally, I don't believe anything that I watch on the news, and I always do my own research. Not necessarily a bad way to think of, but yeah. The world is a stage, and many actors are having fun at our expense, thinking that they are more intelligent than us. It's time for that to change.
Wow.
Some great conspiratorial language in there, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's like that's kind of true. You can't trust everything. People are trying to take advantage of us. You should do your own research, and yet the conclusion is terrible. So I kind of agree that like you should kind of question what you read in the news, but maybe not that the Earth is flat. So that's pretty much it. There was no follow-up. There's no further context to this. Is the city councillor really saying she believes the Earth is flat? It certainly seems like that. Alternatively, she may not believe that at all, but generally be paying some kind of lip service to the kind of idea that there are a lot of things that we can't really know, and why do we take things for granted? There may be some mocking sarcasm in here, but I couldn't really tell specifically. It does sound like she is questioning that the Earth may not be round. Those who saw articles on this in English may have also seen passing references to other comments she made about Islamophobia. The differences between English and French reporting were a bit jarring. The English media in Canada, the US, and worldwide focused on these comments about the Earth being flat, which actually predates the Islamophobia comments, but they made headlines afterwards. So it was something she said, someone reported on it, but then when she was kind of in the press, it was like, by the way, you know that lady that said those things about Islamophobia? She thinks the Earth is flat. Now, French media, on the other hand, was more focused on her comments about Islamophobia, as these comments about the Earth being flat were just sort of adding to that story. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about what was said and give some context to the political climate in which they were stated. Now, there's a lot of coverage of Quebec politics in the French media, and only some of this makes headlines elsewhere in English Canada. I think that there's just sort of it's just sort of less portable just because of that language barrier. I'm discussing this. I'm certainly not trying to defend or excuse anything being said. I simply want to give some context for our listeners. Now, basically, Nathalie Lemieux got in trouble for saying the following in a newspaper interview on the topic of Islamophobia. Pour moi, ce mot n'existe pas. Justin Trudeau pense que l'islamophobie existe, mais c'est lui qui invente ce problème. Il tente de provoquer des problèmes où il n'y en a pas. Les Québécois ne sont pas aussi racistes que certains voudraient le faire croire. Quand un peuple veut s'intégrer, il s'intègre et ce peuple ne s'intègre pas.
To me, this word doesn't even exist. Justin Trudeau thinks Islamophobia exists, but it's him that's inventing this problem. He's trying to create problems where there are none. Quebecers aren't racist, as some would have you believe. When a group wants to integrate themselves, they integrate, and these people aren't integrating themselves. So I think it was that last bit that was controversial. So this led to a great deal of controversy. As a result, the mayor of Gatineau, Maxime Pedneau-Jobin, removed her position as deputy mayor, though he is unable to stop her from being a city councillor. She was elected to that position. Now, a bit of context here. Though municipal elections here generally do not have parties, Maxime Pedneau-Jobin does have his own party, Action Gatineau, of which Nathalie Nemure was not part of in the 2017 election. There is no party affiliation between the two. But since it's municipal, there's no real parties here. Can't kick her out of any kind of party. She later went on to clarify her position, stating, amongst other things, that, and I quote and translate here, "We should remain critical of all cultural and religious practices that do not respect human rights, equality between men and women, as well as children's rights. This is a subject which is important to talk about and an important part of getting along." She further clarifies generally that while she doesn't believe Islamophobia is a societal problem in Quebec, that she does not deny that prejudice does exist. Now, this clarification about human rights is a completely reasonable comment and a reason for which I don't really like the term Islamophobia. One should absolutely be free to criticize the religion of Islam, or any religion for that matter, especially when this religion is a source of so much hate and suffering in the world. That's not to say that there isn't racism towards Muslim people and that should not be denounced, absolutely. All said, I don't find her comments to be all that surprising. Not to say that I don't take issue with them, but they are far from being a view which I see as being inconsistent with that many people in Quebec believe. info@trcpodcast.com. Surely many people disagree with them, as we have seen in the reaction, but with a bit of understanding of what brought on these comments, we can say that they didn't come out of nowhere. These comments came in the wake of similar comments made by the Premier of Quebec, François Legault, also called the Prime Minister of Quebec by French people. He was deciding against making January 29th an official day against Islamophobia in Quebec and stated that there was no Islamophobia in the province. He later went on to specify that there was no undercurrent of Islamophobia, but admitted that there were racist actions which should be denounced and confronted. This is a bit of a nebulous statement. It's like, is Quebec racist? Is Quebec Islamophobic? But if you admit that there can be like Islamophobic people, but that the province itself isn't really Islamophobic, well, it's hard to really come down with a firm answer on that. In general, I find that there is a certain amount of what I would hesitate to call xenophobia, but just a general attitude of trying to protect the culture of Quebec. When I think of Canadian culture, I generally come up with a few nebulous things. Beer and maple syrup, winter sports, complaining about winter. But I also think of multiculturalism as being a big part of Canadian culture. But Quebec culture really is its own thing, and something that the people of Quebec actively try to protect. And this is most often seen in the protection of the French language itself. The French language is legally and politically protected, and amongst the people there is often a sense of protection of that culture, of that language. This brings us back to the 2018 provincial election, in which the CAQ, that's the Coalition Avenir Québec, along with François Legault, claimed victory with a platform which seemed to resonate well with the people of the province. Amongst other things, Legault stated that there should be a test of values for new immigrants, including questions like, do you believe men and women are equal? Do you believe in a secular state where laws take precedence over religion? Do you recognize that this is a democratic society? Do you recognize that homosexuals have the same rights in our society? He also suggested a French test for all new immigrants to Quebec, those coming from outside of Canada, not within Canada, after living there for 3 years. Now, in considering this, does a councillor stating that Muslims don't integrate themselves seem all that out of place? Beyond this, there is also a strong secular aspect to Quebec. And Quebec used to be a very religious province, but then there was the Quiet Revolution in the 60s and 70s where they abandoned religious school systems and it really became much more secular. This results in such things as Bill 62, which bans anyone whose face is covered from delivering or receiving a public service. And this is supported by 76% of the people of Quebec. Now, federally, some people may remember this, the NDP's colossal failure to make any success in Quebec in the 2015 federal election was partly due to their stance on the niqab issue. The NDP's poll results leading up to the election dropped significantly in the province when Tom Mulcair firmly upheld his belief that wearing the niqab at a citizenship ceremony should be protected. Many in Quebec opposed allowing the niqab at the ceremony. As the party's numbers dropped in Quebec, the rest of the country followed suit, cementing their failure, and Justin Trudeau did quite well as a result. So to circle back, yes, a councillor here in Gatineau really did seem to defend flat earthers. Without more context, it's hard to say whether she really believes the earth is flat or is just open to this ludicrous idea. More generally, she made some controversial comments about Muslim people in Quebec. The attitudes surrounding these issues are complex, and I believe with some understanding of the values of this province, such as secularism and a desire to protect Quebec and French culture, we can put some perspective on the issue. I can hardly hope to do such a huge topic justice in such a short segment, but I hope I was able to give just a little bit of context here. Now, at the end of the day, the city of Gatineau is, practically speaking, a mostly flat area on a very large oblate spheroid, which is home to many Muslim people. As idiotic as believing in a flat earth may be, one's views on Islamophobia are certainly more relevant to one's ability to act as city councillor in Gatineau.
Thanks, Adam. And thank you, listeners, for joining us once again. Cristina gave us a bit of a silver lining on a horrible measles situation that kids are trying to fight back against their irrational parents. Good for them. Power to the people. I talked to you about Canada's forests and our carbon emissions, which are up or down depending on the math you want to do. And Adam covered a local councillor who said some things, Islamophobic perhaps, flat earther perhaps, but we'll see if that really impacts her job or what the future holds for her. I'll be in Egypt and Jordan by the time you hear this, so send me a note if you happen to live there. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.